Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that I've been doing talking about Black Marxism on the upcoming water resolution. In this video I want to talk a little bit about a particular situation where I think Black Marx will definitely have a lot of interesting things to say on this upcoming resolution, which is Black Marxism as a negative strategy versus critical teams. I think this strategy is really good and really viable against a lot of critical apps that I'm predicting to show up on this resolution, because I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about the necessity of a pragmatic framing for how we think about water, and I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about why there's also a necessity to different types of infrastructure institutions and forms of vertical organizing that I think compete with a lot of the visions that teams will kind of be offering and epistemologies that they'll kind of be offering in terms of a reframing for how we think about water, that I think you can definitely push with really kind of clear and foundational framing arguments that I think really set out clear points of offense for you to really have relevant debates that I think ultimately push questions on that every critical team that I think should really have to be able to answer. And I think that at the same time there's a lot of really complex history that you can tap into in order to really think about very contextual responses to a wide range of critical affirmatives, while still being able to tap into a lot of the normative cap K arguments that I think are really comfortable for a lot of teams that are kind of getting into this type of argument, and that I think overall are just useful on the resolution as a whole. When I'm thinking about what the best form of this type of criticism is versus K teams, I think that it's really important to frame the arguments that you really want to make at this criticism as one that does a couple things. First, requires them to recognize the way in which slavery kind of represents and creates a particular framing for how we think about water and its relationship to various forms of community development, gentrification, etc., and other practices that are connected to neoliberalism and other types of violent ways of thinking about how water as a resource is related to capitalism. And I think that when you have that contextualization, it does a couple things. First of all, it sets the uniqueness question for why the particular types of conversations that we have about water are prevalent to the particular strategies that debaters, not only from the various social locations that they take up from sometimes being from these communities, etc., take from just debating itself as actual value, but also the particular usage and the kind of importance of the particular resolution as an opportunity to create plans for something that is extremely politically and culturally relevant to how we think about the role that politics plays in basic human rights, resources, protections, etc. And I think that being able to frame this as something that really impedes on both of the theoretical level that these criticisms are really thinking about the role that water plays as a particular racializing structure, but also the way in which that implicates the kind of material practices and the need for material practices on other teams actually kind of imposes, I think, a lot of diverse offense for you to make. And I think oftentimes can make it really easy for you to really push a lot of offensive arguments that I think can be really clearly set up as long as you're really identifying clear places in your frame argument that show why the kind of necessity for planning in the status quo is necessary in order to kind of continue the creation of movements and tactics that kind of pull from the types of historical examples that I think you can use to really kind of dominate and push the conversation in these debates to a place that is really, really comfortable for you, and also means that you can use these kind of top level portions of the debate to really make it harder for the other team to win arguments permutations and really strong thesis claims in order for you to make the type of offense that you want. I think that when you're generally thinking about how you want to use the framing portion of the debate, I think that the first place that I would think about is how can you kind of use the thesis question of how water presents current crisis to various communities, and the way that it's kind of used as a tool of racial dispossession and the continuation of capitalism, and how it that kind of top level impact comparison stuff as really what fuels the kind of necessity or the usage for debate as a particular planning space for anti-capital resistance. And I think that then you kind of need to frame the question as what type of methodology gets us closer towards anti-capital resistance and praxis that is able to move against the way in which racial capitalism works as a divisive structure. And I think that using that to kind of frame why the relevancy of the type of revolutionary education, and why the particular terms in which holding the affirmative to particular examples and other static portions that can be isolated via things like cross-section speeches are really important ways of really framing where the kind of offense is going to be in the debate, and how you want the judge to really think about weighing the methodologies, because I think it sets a really clear precedent for like how the offense and defense weighs against each other, and gives also the judge a really clear explanation of like how the impact comparison stuff that you'll want to do way later on in the flow is really framing and making possible the other sources that you're kind of like pulling from here. And I think that developing your critique into something that's kind of supercharged by this like large level impact comparison question can be really important for you to like frame a lot of the resolutions that you're giving to the types of offense that teams want to sit most comfortably in. Because then I think when you move to your thesis question, I think you have such a large history to pull from in terms of not only just the question of just like water's relationship to racial dispossession, but the way in which various types of communities have set up alternative infrastructures for how they respond to various types of crises against human rights and resource and disparity. And I think that those types of like histories can like also set up a lot of uniqueness in terms of like the way in which those tactics kind of have produced present day type of tactics, movements, and ways to relating to water that I think you can use to full uniqueness question about like the possibility and the usage of revolutionary energy that's kind of already present in the status quo that kind of makes it necessary for us to particularly use like racial capitalism as a frame for how we kind of connect like dispossession and empower folk that are kind of on the margin while thinking through like this kind of like overarching structure that really inflicts damage like across like various types of sectors of society. And I think that really focusing on the way in which like being able to focus on some of like the key tenets of how things like Black Marxism have really used and focus on like the most marginalized in society, from like its conceptualization of the lumpen proletariat as taken from Mao to kind of like describe the relationship that, for instance, those with dishonored labor, prisoners, when you're thinking of sex workers, etc., have all created various types of alternative ways of thinking about community that change the way that we think about resource distribution, mutual aid strategies as a whole, and have kind of changed the way in which like organizing as that kind of takes place in the present. And I think imposing a lot of this explanation in terms of why the particular types of organizing models that the alternative and other sources of the debate will really cite from are really important points of conversation for the resolution as a whole, but also really important in terms of like at sequencing the value of like what types of methodologies and frames of thinking are really important and should be sitting on the judge's minds as they're sorting through the ballot, which should ultimately be the question of like how all of your speeches and ways of thinking about these strategies should be like informing the debate as a whole. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into other videos and thinking about doing it in terms of Black Marxism and water. And yeah, I'm really enjoying doing this series, and hopefully you're rocking with it too. Thank you.